This Sunday is the fourth Sunday in Ordinary Time, Year B. The first reading this Sunday is from the book of Deuteronomy. The first 5 books of the Bible are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In Jewish tradition, these 5 books are known as the written Torah. The traditional belief is that these 5 books were written by Moses, except for the last part of Deuteronomy, which describes the death of Moses. In Jewish, Islamic, and Christian tradition, Abraham lived about 1,800 years before Jesus. You might remember that in his old age, he and his wife Sarah had a son, Isaac. Isaac and his wife Rebecca had 2 sons, one named Jacob. One night, when Jacob was a grown man, he got into a strange wrestling match with a mystery opponent. They wrestled until the sun came up and Jacob didn't lose. The opponent refused to reveal his name, but said to Jacob, "You shall no longer be called Jacob. You will be called Israel," which means one who wrestles with God, or one who strives with God. Jacob, that is Israel, had 12 sons. One of those sons, Joseph, was sold by his brothers into slavery in Egypt. Joseph was gifted. He became an important official in Egypt and saved the country from famine by warning the Egyptian pharaoh to save grain. Meanwhile, Joseph's father and brothers and their families were starving. So Joseph invited them to come and live in Egypt, and they came. 400 years later, the descendants of Israel were being treated as slaves in Egypt. The Pharaoh worried that those slaves would rise up against him, so he set about killing their children. One of the Israelite mothers, Jochebed, placed her baby in a basket on the Nile River to save the baby. The baby was discovered by the Pharaoh's daughter, who raised the child, a boy, as her own. She named him Moses, which means to raise out of, because she raised Moses out of the water. Moses grew up. One day he found an Egyptian beating up one of the Israelites, and he killed the Egyptian. Moses ran away to avoid the death penalty. God ordered Moses to return to Egypt to rescue the Israelites from their slavery. Moses obeyed, returned and led the Israelites out of Egypt, heading east across the Red Sea. Moses and the Israelites spent 40 years in the desert together. It was during this time that Moses received the 10 Commandments from God at Mount Sinai, also known as Mount Horeb, on the day known as the Day of the Assembly. Mount Horeb and the Day of the Assembly are mentioned in this week's reading. The book of Deuteronomy is traditionally thought to be a record of 3 speeches made by Moses to the Israelites at the end of their 40 years in the desert, before they crossed into the land promised by God. The name, Deuteronomy, comes from an ancient Greek word which means repeated law. Mainly, Deuteronomy is Moses summarizing the rules that the Israelites should live by. The second reading this week, again, is from St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. It is in a similar vein to last week. The members of the early church expected Jesus to return any day. St. Paul was very keen to make sure that they were all ready. In this week's Gospel, we find Jesus teaching in a synagogue in Capernaum. Capernaum was a small fishing village on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. It had a population of about 1,500 people in the time of Jesus. The people in Capernaum recognized that Jesus teaches with authority, unlike the scribes there, who were mainly responsible for copying and teaching the Torah, well before the days of printing. It is here, in the synagogue at Capernaum, that Jesus performs the first miracle recorded in Mark's Gospel, astonishing the locals.